Alexander the Great is often remembered as the man who led the Macedonian army across Asia Minor, defeated Persia, and then advanced deep into Central Asia and northwestern India. Julius Caesar is remembered for the campaigns that changed the fate of the Roman Republic, while Augustus entered history for transforming that republic into a monarchy while preserving many of its older forms. Genghis Khan united the tribes of the steppe and began an empire that stretched across the Eurasian continent. Ashoka is remembered as a conqueror who later tried to find a different way to rule, while Napoleon, born on an island at the edge of the French world, once forced much of Europe to reshape its future around his decisions. Each of these figures emerged from a different setting, left a different legacy, and was remembered by later generations through a mixture of evidence, memory, and legend. Yet centuries before Alexander, Caesar, Genghis Khan, or Napoleon, there was a king who rose from a realm that was not the wealthiest center in Western Asia and laid the foundations of a political order far larger than anything his family had ever controlled. His name was Cyrus II, more commonly known in the modern world as Cyrus the Great. Before he became master of Media, Lydia, and Babylon, Cyrus was a prince from the family that ruled Anshan on the Iranian plateau. He was probably born around 600 before the Common Era, although no contemporary record confirms either the exact year or the precise location of his birth. A tradition preserved by Cicero states that Cyrus became king at about the age of 40, ruled for nearly 3 decades, and died in 530 before the Common Era. On that basis, many scholars place his birth around the year 600. Other calculations move the date closer to 590. The most responsible approach, then, is not to claim that he was born on a known day, or even in a firmly established year. It is to say that Cyrus spent his childhood in the early 6th century before the Common Era, in the Persian world of what is now southern Iran. The land ruled by his family was generally known as Anshan. That name had a history older than Cyrus's own dynasty and was associated with a region deeply shaped by Elamite culture. By the time of Cyrus, Persian speakers of an Iranian language were already present there, but they did not live apart from the older communities. The southern Iranian plateau was a landscape of valleys, high plains, mountain ranges, seasonal pastures, and routes connecting the interior with Elam and the lowlands of Mesopotamia. To the Babylonians, this was an eastern country lying beyond long roads and mountain chains. To the family of Cyrus, it was home, a source of manpower, the foundation of loyal relationships, and the original limit of their power. Anshan could not compare with Babylon in urban scale, written tradition, or the wealth of its temples. Nor did it resemble Lydia, whose capital at Sardis stood close to the commercial currents of Anatolia and the Aegean world. Egypt, to the southwest, already possessed a state, monumental temples, and a memory of kingship stretching back thousands of years. Even Media, the power to the north and northwest, was later described by Greek authors as far stronger than the Persian kingdom. Cyrus was therefore not born without status, but neither did he inherit an empire that already reached from sea to sea. His starting point lay between those extremes. He stood above most people because he belonged to a royal family, yet his inheritance was small beside the territory he would control by the end of his life. Cyrus's father was Cambyses I, king of Anshan. He should not be confused with Cambyses II, the son who would eventually succeed Cyrus. Very little evidence survives about Cambyses I. What we know of his title comes mainly from the royal texts in which Cyrus described his own ancestry. On the Cyrus cylinder, the conqueror of Babylon introduced himself as the son of Cambyses, the great king of Anshan, the grandson of Cyrus, another king of Anshan, and a descendant of Tespes. That list did more than provide a genealogy. It carried a political message. The man who had just taken control of Babylon was not an adventurer who had suddenly appeared from nowhere. He belonged to a family that had exercised kingship for generations. The identity of Cyrus's mother is more complicated. Herodotus and Xenophon call her Mandane, daughter of Astyages, king of Media. If that relationship reflects historical reality, Cyrus carried the blood of the Persian ruling house while also being directly connected to the Median royal family. This would help explain why stories of his rebellion are so often told as a conflict within a family rather than simply a war between two peoples. Contemporary cuneiform texts, however, do not confirm that Mandane was Cyrus's mother. The Greek tradition may preserve an accurate memory of a political marriage between the two dynasties, but it may also have made Cyrus's succession to Median power seem more legitimate and easier to understand by turning him into the grandson of Astyages. Mandane should therefore remain part of his biography, but only with the reminder that we have entered the borderland between history and a family tradition shaped by later storytellers. Whatever his mother's identity, Cyrus grew up in a dynasty that understood marriage, bloodline, and loyalty to be as important as victory in battle. Power in Western Asia was not organized along the clear national borders shown on modern maps. A king might rule a central territory directly, receive tribute from more distant leaders, depend on a marriage alliance with another house, and at the same time acknowledge the superior status of a greater power. Cyrus's family ruled as kings in Anshan, but they still seem to have lived under the influence of Astyages or to have recognized his supremacy. These overlapping relationships formed the political environment that a young prince had to observe before he was old enough to rule in his own name. The world surrounding Cyrus at his birth was also living with the memory of a vanished empire. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which had once controlled much of Western Asia through its armies, bureaucracy, and large-scale forced migrations, collapsed near the end of the 7th century before the Common Era. Nineveh fell in 612 before the Common Era, little more than a decade before the date often associated with Cyrus's birth. Other powers then divided the space Assyria had left behind. Babylon under the Chaldean dynasty controlled Mesopotamia and much of the west. Media emerged on the Iranian plateau. Lydia dominated western Anatolia. Egypt pursued its own interests in the eastern Mediterranean. None of these kingdoms existed in isolation. They exchanged metals, grain, animals, luxury goods, craftspeople, information, and people who had been forced from their homes. War altered borders, but most daily life still depended on agriculture, canals, herds, markets, temples, and the work of scribes. Cyrus did not invent empire out of nothing. Earlier, rulers had created roads, methods of taxation, systems of tribute, granaries, diplomatic ceremonies, and many ways of compelling distant regions to obey. Assyria had placed officials in provinces, developed lines of communication, and relied on both violence and cooperation with local elites. Babylon inherited much of the experience of Mesopotamia, where government through written records had been developing for centuries. Elam left its own traditions in the regions around Anshan and Susa. What made the life of Cyrus different was not that he became the first person to imagine all these tools, it was his ability to absorb them from several political worlds, bring them under a new dynasty, and extend that structure on a scale never before achieved in Persian history. The real childhood of Cyrus is almost entirely absent from contemporary records. Later writers filled that silence with one of the most famous stories told by Herodotus. According to the Greek historian, Astyages dreamed that his daughter Mandane gave birth to a stream of water that flooded Asia. In another dream, a vine grew from her body and spread across a vast territory. The interpreters at court warned that Mandane's child would replace Astyages. Fearing the prophecy, the king married his daughter to Cambyses, whom he considered less dangerous than a Median nobleman. Then, after Cyrus was born, he ordered the child to be killed. The task was given to Harpagus, an important member of the Median court. Harpagus did not want to bear direct responsibility for killing a royal child, so he passed the order to one of the king's herdsmen, usually called Mithridates. When the herdsman returned home, his wife had just delivered a stillborn child. The couple decided to raise Cyrus and use the body of their own infant to convince the inspectors that the command of Astyages had been carried out. Cyrus grew up in their household until he was about 10 years old. During a game, the other children chose him as king. Cyrus ordered the punishment of a nobleman's son who refused to obey him, and the incident reached Astyages. The king recognized something in the child's appearance and behavior, opened an investigation, and discovered the truth. In the account of Herodotus, the dream interpreters assured Astyages that the prophecy had already been fulfilled in a harmless way. Cyrus had been called king during a children's game, they argued, so there was no longer any reason to fear that the boy would seize a real throne. Cyrus was sent back to his parents in Persia. Harpagus was not forgiven. Astyages invited him to a banquet, secretly killed the son of Harpagus, and served the father a meal prepared from the child's body. When Harpagus learned what had happened, he concealed his rage, waited for years, and eventually helped Cyrus rebel. The story is structured with almost perfect precision. The warning dreams, the rescued child, the cruel king, the injured courtier who quietly prepares revenge, and the prophecy fulfilled by the very actions taken to prevent it. That perfection is precisely what makes modern historians cautious. The motif of a royal child marked for death and rescued by ordinary people appears in many traditions. Sargon of Akkad was said to have been placed in a basket and set adrift on a river. Moses escaped an order to kill infant boys and was raised in another household. Romulus and Remus were abandoned before becoming figures associated with the origins of Rome. These stories are not identical, but each turns the founder of a new order into someone protected by fate before he was able to protect himself. Herodotus acknowledged that he knew several versions of Cyrus's origins and had simply chosen the one he considered most credible. Even so, the story contains unmistakable signs of folklore. Another tradition associated with Theseus and preserved by later authors goes even further. In this version, Cyrus was not the grandson of Astyages and did not even come from Achaemenid royalty. His father was described as a poor man who survived through banditry, his mother as a goatherd, and Cyrus as someone who entered the Median court in a low position and gradually rose through the ranks. That account conflicts with the texts produced by Cyrus's own court, in which he declared that his father, grandfather, and earlier ancestor had all been kings of Anshan. The story of Ctesias probably reflects a hostile tradition intended to weaken the legitimacy of the Persian conqueror. The conflict between the sources shows that the biography of Cyrus became a battlefield of memory very early. Those who wanted to honor him made him a child chosen by destiny, while those who wanted to diminish him turned him into a usurper without royal blood. Behind these legends, what can be said with greater confidence is that Cyrus belonged to the family ruling Anshan and was probably prepared for a royal role. A prince in southern Iran during the early 6th century before the Common Era did not attend school in the modern sense. His education most likely took place through family life, court ritual, hunting, the management of property, and the observation of negotiations among powerful people. He needed to ride, use weapons, understand how to distribute gifts, and maintain loyalty. He also had to recognize the difference between stable farming districts and communities that moved with the seasons, between power rooted in cities and power rooted in personal relationships, and between an oath kept out of respect and one that lasted only until the balance of power changed. Xenophon, writing the Cyropaedia in the 4th century before the Common Era, created a detailed educational program for Cyrus. In his account, the young prince learned self-control, justice, discipline, command, and the art of winning the goodwill of others. Xenophon's Cyrus knew when to offer praise, rewarded loyalty, shared hardship with his soldiers, and inspired those around him to serve willingly. Some of these qualities may reflect the lasting reputation of the real king. The Cyropaedia, however, was not a record written during the lifetime of Cyrus. Xenophon used Cyrus to explore a broader question. How could one man gain and preserve authority over many different communities? Read, as a biographical source, the work teaches us much about Cyrus in the Greek imagination, but its conversations should not be treated as words that were actually spoken at the Persian court. For much of his early life, Cyrus remained in the shadow of greater powers. Astyages ruled Media from Ecbatana, a center positioned among important routes across the Iranian plateau. Nabonidus became king of Babylon in 556 before the Common Era. Croesus controlled Lydia and was known for the wealth of Sardis. Farther away, the Greek city-states competed, traded, and formed alliances, while Egypt remained independent. No one looking at Cyrus in his youth could have known that the ruler of Anshan would eventually alter the fate of 3 great kingdoms in succession. That uncertainty must remain part of the story. History often makes an outcome seem inevitable once it has happened, but to the people living at the time, Cyrus was only one prince among many. His future might still have ended through illness, rebellion, defeat, or a political marriage that was never recorded. Around 559 before the Common Era, Cyrus succeeded Cambyses I and became king of Anshan. This date is generally used as the beginning of his reign, although ancient sources sometimes calculate chronology in different ways. Cyrus may have been close to 40 years old if his birth is placed around 600. That creates a different image from the one associated with conquerors who inherited power at a very young age. Alexander was only 20 when he succeeded Philip II. Cyrus had probably spent decades observing government before power came into his hands. Even so, the first phase of his reign remains poorly documented. We do not know how his accession ceremony unfolded, who first swore loyalty to him, or which internal difficulties had to be resolved. Becoming king of Anshan did not immediately make Cyrus king of every Persian community. Persian society appears to have been organized through tribes, lineages, and networks of noble families. Maintaining authority required negotiation with the people who controlled warriors, herds, land, and routes of travel. A king could not simply issue commands from a palace. He had to distribute benefits, protect allies, punish betrayal without creating too many new enemies, and demonstrate that his dynasty possessed the support of tradition and the gods. The skills Cyrus later used on an imperial scale were probably refined in this smaller environment, where a single poor decision could cause another lineage to abandon him before a larger war had even begun. The relationship with Media was the greatest challenge. If Cambyses I had acknowledged the supremacy of Astyages, Cyrus had to decide whether to preserve that arrangement or attempt to change it. Greek sources explained the confrontation through the anger of Harpagus, the prophecies and family ties. Babylonian texts were briefer and showed little interest in scenes of private conflict. The Sipar cylinder of Nabonidus states that the god Marduk caused Cyrus, king of Anshan, to rise against the Medes and defeat the great army of Astyages with a small force. The Nabonidus Chronicle records that Astyages gathered his army to march against Cyrus, but his soldiers rebelled, seized their king, and handed him over to his enemy. These lines do not reveal every step leading to war, but they confirm the core of the event. Cyrus challenged Astyages, and the collapse of the Median king was connected to the loss of loyalty within his own army. The revolt probably began around 553 before the Common Era and continued through several campaigns before ending around 550. The dates are not entirely consistent because the surviving texts are damaged and the sources arrange events differently. If the war truly lasted for several years, it was not a miraculous moment in which all of Media changed hands in a single day. Cyrus had to mobilize the Persians, preserve his alliances, survive setbacks later obscured by the traditions of victory, and convince part of the Median aristocracy that their future would be safer under him. Harpagus probably played an important role, but no single individual could have delivered an entire kingdom to Cyrus if the broader ruling class had remained completely loyal to Astyages. Herodotus tells us that Harpagus secretly sent Cyrus a message hidden inside the body of a hare, and then persuaded a number of Median nobles to betray their king. When Astyages placed Harpagus in command, part of the army deserted during battle. Astyages then took personal command but was defeated and captured. These details give the story a clear dramatic rhythm, yet its most secure element remains the one preserved in the Babylonian chronicle. The Median army rebelled against its own ruler. This reveals a pattern that would recur in the career of Cyrus. He did not always win by confronting the undivided strength of an enemy. He exploited existing divisions and persuaded people who had served his opponents to recognize an advantage in the new order. Around 550 before the Common Era, Astyages was defeated. Cyrus entered Ecbatana, took control of the capital, and carried the royal treasury back to his own lands. To the people of Anshan, the gold, silver, weapons, animals, ceremonial objects, and other property of the Median court must have exceeded anything they had ever seen concentrated in one place. Yet the victory brought more than wealth. It gave Cyrus access to roads, dependent territories, tribute networks, and the prestige of a man who had overthrown a long-established king. From this point forward, he was no longer a local ruler living beneath Median power. He had become the successor to the authority Astyages had once claimed. What Cyrus did with Astyages after the victory cannot be established with certainty. Herodotus says that the defeated king was spared and lived the rest of his life under the control of Cyrus. Ctesias offers different details, including a story in which Cyrus married Amytis, the daughter of Astyages, after executing her previous husband. Xenophon constructed a sequence in which Median power came to Cyrus through marriage and inheritance, softening the reality of conquest. These versions reflect a need to explain how the Persians replaced the Medes without producing a complete break in political life. Although the personal fate of Astyages remains unclear, there is no sign that Cyrus tried to remove all Medes from government. On the contrary, Medes continued to serve beside Persians in the army, at court, and in the imperial administration. This continuity was both practical and symbolic. If Cyrus had killed or dispossessed every Median nobleman, he would have been forced to govern a vast territory with a smaller pool of experienced officials while facing continuous resistance. By allowing status, property, or opportunities for service to those willing to transfer their loyalty, he gained access to knowledge of roads, local conditions, tribute relationships, and court ceremony. Ancient kings rarely had an entirely new administration waiting to replace the old one. Victorious rulers usually had to depend on people who had once kept records, assembled supplies, and transmitted orders for their enemies. Cyrus appears to have understood that obedience lasted longer when influential people did not believe that everything they possessed would disappear with their former king. From Media, Cyrus also absorbed the language of power. Titles such as Great King, King of Kings, and King of the Lands had existed before him. Median clothing, court organization, and ceremony appear to have entered Persian royal life. Borrowing these elements did not make Cyrus less Persian. It allowed him to speak a political language already understood by communities that had belonged to Media. He would later do something similar in Babylon with even greater subtlety, presenting himself through the traditions of Babylonian kingship instead of demanding that the people of the city accept a completely foreign system of symbols. His first great victory over Astyages therefore did more than enlarge a map. It taught Cyrus how a conqueror could become a successor. Taking over Media also confronted the Persian king with greater responsibilities. To the west lay Lydia, ruled from Sardis by Croesus. Between the two powers stood Cappadocia and the Halys River, often regarded as the boundary between Lydia and Media. To the east and northeast were broad territories where control depended less on dense networks of cities than on fortresses, alliances, and the ability to move across great distances. Armenia, Parthia, Hyrcania, and other lands that had once maintained ties with Media now had to decide whether they would accept Cyrus. One victory over Astyages did not automatically make them submit. During 549 and 548 before the Common Era, the Persians probably consolidated authority in regions such as Parthia, Hyrcania, or Armenia, although the exact sequence remains disputed. Cyrus had to turn victory in an internal war into a structure capable of supplying troops, food, and political recognition. It was in this setting that Pasargadae began to mean more than a royal residence. The name Pasargadae is connected to the Persian group to which the Achaemenid family belonged, although the linguistic and historical interpretation of the name is not entirely simple. The site stood on the Murghab plain, surrounded by mountains and supplied with enough water to support a royal landscape. Cyrus selected it as the first center of the new dynasty. Construction probably began after the victory over Media, but many projects continued in later years, and some remained unfinished when he died. Pasargadae was not a densely packed city of crowded houses like Babylon. Its palaces, gates, audience halls, and gardens were arranged across an open landscape. Stone channels carried water through ordered spaces, irrigated plantings, and created a striking contrast with the plateau environment. A large stone platform, now known as Tal-e-Takht, rose above the surrounding ground and appears to have been intended as the foundation for a royal or defensive complex. The original design was not completed before later rulers altered the project. Elsewhere stood columned buildings, broad entrances, and reliefs that reveal a new court art taking shape through many different influences. The stoneworkers and architectural ideas used at Pasargadae probably came from land Cyrus had recently brought under his authority. Some techniques suggest connections with Lydia and Ionia, while other traditions came from Mesopotamia, Elam, or the Iranian plateau. The royal garden inherited forms long established in Western Asia, but it arranged them in ways that became a precedent for later Achaemenid palace landscapes. We do not need to imagine Cyrus drawing every water channel with his own hand in order to recognize his influence. A king who selected craftspeople, materials, and symbols from many regions was declaring that his new court could gather different worlds around a single center. Pasargadae also reveals the limits of what we know about Cyrus. Inscriptions bearing his name at the site may have been installed or completed under Darius more than a decade after Cyrus died. A famous relief showing a four-winged figure was once confidently identified with Cyrus, but it cannot simply be treated as an accurate portrait of the king. The surviving architecture passed through several phases of alteration and use. When we imagine Cyrus walking among the stone columns or observing water entering a new garden, we should present the scene only as a possibility consistent with the setting, not as an event recorded by an eyewitness. The stones tell us that he created a royal center. They do not tell us where he stood on a particular afternoon or what he felt as the buildings rose around him. As Pasargadae took shape, the new position of Cyrus demanded the attention of Croesus. Lydia was neither distant nor weak. Its capital at Sardis stood in western Anatolia, close to the routes connecting the interior with the Aegean coast. The surrounding region was famous for precious metals, especially the gold carried in the sediments of the Pactolus River. The Mermnad dynasty of Croesus had extended its influence over the Greek cities of the coast and participated in a wide diplomatic network. The name Croesus later became a synonym for wealth, but to Cyrus he was first of all a king with an army, a treasury, allies, and interests threatened by the collapse of Media. Herodotus connected Croesus to Astyages through family ties and said that the Lydian king wished to avenge his brother-in-law. His practical motives were surely broader. When Media changed hands, a power vacuum opened in eastern Anatolia. If Croesus did nothing, Cyrus would inherit the claims of Astyages and advance toward the Lydian frontier. If Croesus attacked first, he might stop the growth of Persia and enlarge his own territory. In a world of competing kingdoms, war was often explained through honor or vengeance, but behind those explanations stood roads, fortresses, revenue, and the need to prevent a rival from becoming too powerful. Before the campaign, Croesus was said to have sent messengers to several oracles in order to test them, after which he placed particular trust in the oracle at Delphi. When he asked whether he should attack Persia, he received the answer that if he crossed the Halys River, a great empire would be destroyed. Croesus assumed that the empire would be the one ruled by Cyrus. After Lydia was defeated, the prophecy was reinterpreted. The empire that had been destroyed was his own. This is one of the most famous episodes in Herodotus because it captures the uncertainty of fate and the danger of hearing only what one wishes to hear. Yet the account is also too perfectly arranged to serve as a precise diplomatic record. Delphi did maintain a real relationship with Croesus, and the gifts Lydia dedicated in Greece were not invented, but the form of the prophecy may have been shaped after the outcome of the war was already known. Around 547 or 546 before the Common Era, depending on how a damaged passage in the Nabonidus Chronicle is interpreted, the conflict between Lydia and Persia entered its decisive phase. Croesus crossed the Halys River and advanced into Cappadocia, a region that had once belonged to the Median sphere of influence. The two armies met near Pteria. Herodotus describes a fierce battle that ended without a clear victor. At the end of the day, Croesus realized that his forces were smaller and withdrew to Sardis. He intended to summon additional allies, possibly including Babylon, Egypt, and Sparta, and resume the war after winter. By the customary logic of ancient campaigning, this was not an unreasonable decision. Armies depended on the seasons, supplies of food, animals, and the ability to concentrate forces. Croesus had reason to believe that Cyrus would also stop. Cyrus did not behave as Croesus expected. Instead of allowing his opponent time to rebuild his army and receive allied reinforcements, he pursued him rapidly across Anatolia. This decision is often overshadowed by the stories of camels and prophecy, but it may have been the most important moment of the campaign. An army advancing across a great distance needed food, knowledge of the roads, and the ability to preserve order behind it. Cyrus accepted risk in exchange for speed and forced Croesus to fight before his diplomatic plans were complete. This choice cannot be explained by boldness alone. It required Cyrus to assess his opponent's condition accurately and to trust that his own forces could endure the continued march. The major battle took place on the plain near Sardis and was later commonly known as the Battle of Thymbra. Lydia was famous for its cavalry, a force capable of threatening the Persian formations. Herodotus says that Cyrus followed the advice of Harpagus and brought forward the camels normally used to carry baggage, placing soldiers on their backs. The Lydian horses, unfamiliar with the smell and appearance of the camels, panicked and deprived the cavalry of its advantage. The Lydian horsemen dismounted and continued to fight, but they were eventually forced to retreat into the city. The detail involving the camels may preserve a real tactic, but it should not become the only explanation for the victory. The result also depended on numbers, discipline, terrain, leadership, and the fact that Croesus had not yet assembled all the forces he wanted. Sardis was protected by walls and a high citadel on a steep mountainside. The Lydians may have believed that the position was nearly impossible to capture. Herodotus says that after about 14 days, a Persian soldier saw one of the defenders drop his helmet and then descend by a route that no one had thought could be climbed. The Persians used the same path to enter the city. Like many stories about the fall of a fortress, the episode emphasizes the complacency of the defenders and the careful observation of the attackers. Archaeology at Sardis shows that the city suffered destruction in the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, consistent with the Persian conquest, but it does not fully confirm the story of a soldier discovering a hidden path. What is certain is that Sardis fell and the independent kingdom of Lydia came to an end. The fate of Croesus became the subject of several legends. In the best-known version, Cyrus ordered that he be placed on a funeral pyre. As the fire was about to rise, Croesus called out the name of Solon, the Athenian wise man who had warned that no person could be called happy before the end of life was known. Cyrus became curious, listened to the explanation, and realized that fortune could turn against any king. He ordered the flames extinguished, but his men could not control them, so the god Apollo sent rain to save Croesus. The Lydian king then became an advisor to the man who had conquered him. For Greek readers, the story carried a powerful moral meaning. Power and wealth could not guarantee a fortunate end, and today's victor might become tomorrow's defeated king. Whether Croesus truly survived the fall of Sardis remains unclear. Different Greek sources tended to preserve him as an advisor, but contemporary evidence offers no definite answer. Some scholars have argued that Cyrus executed him and that the story of mercy developed from the image of a tolerant conqueror. A responsible biography of Cyrus must preserve both possibilities. If Croesus was spared, it would fit the pattern in which Cyrus retained useful figures from defeated regimes. If he died, the silence of the record reminds us that ancient conquest was never a process without victims. We do not need to choose a definite ending simply because legend offers a more satisfying one. The capture of Lydia gave Cyrus more than fame. The treasury at Sardis provided his court with resources for new campaigns and construction projects. The region controlled routes leading to the Aegean coast where goods, silver, craftspeople and ideas moved between Anatolia and the Greek world. Cyrus took over an existing system of officials, cities, tax obligations, and dependent relationships. He could not manage all of it from Pasargadae. Appointees on the ground had to guard the treasury, collect tribute, and prevent rebellion. It was here, immediately after victory, that the limits of newly declared loyalty became visible. Cyrus assigned a Lydian named Pactyes to manage the treasury and the transfer of property, while a Persian official named Tabalus held the citadel of Sardis. After Cyrus departed, Pactyes used money to hire soldiers, stirred up a rebellion, and besieged the Persian force in the citadel. The crisis showed that a policy of employing local figures did not always succeed. Delegating power could ease pressure on the new regime, but it could also allow an official to use imperial resources against the conqueror. Cyrus received the news while traveling east. Herodotus says that he was furious and initially wanted to punish the Lydians severely, but that a man identified as Croesus, if the story of his survival is correct, persuaded him to respond differently. The detail cannot be fully verified, yet it reflects a genuine problem. Once the battlefield fell silent, an empire still had to confront resistance. The generals of Cyrus, first Mazares and then Harpagus after the death of Mazares, suppressed the revolt and continued the conquest of cities along the coast. Pactyes fled from one place to another in search of refuge, forcing Greek communities to choose between protecting a suppliant and risking conflict with Persia. He was eventually handed over. Cyrus does not appear personally in every scene of this account, but that absence reveals a new phase in his career. As king of Anshan, his authority had depended heavily on his physical presence. After the conquests of Media and Lydia, he had to rule through generals, messengers, and representatives. Decisions made hundreds or thousands of miles away still carried the king's name and shaped the way local people viewed his dynasty. The Ionian cities that had once obeyed Croesus now faced the Persian Empire. Some hoped to be accepted on terms they had rejected before the war. Cyrus did not allow all of them to return to their former position. Cities that resisted were attacked one after another by his commanders. Harpagus was said to have used earthen mounds to reach the tops of walls, a siege method familiar in Western Asia. Phocaea and Teos chose partial migration rather than complete submission, while other communities remained and adapted. Their inhabitants did not become Persian. They kept their languages, gods, harbors, and many local institutions, but they now had to acknowledge a distant king, provide tribute, and live under rulers supported by the imperial court. For later Greek history, Persian control of Ionia began a chain of relationships that led to the Ionian Revolt early in the 5th century and the famous wars under Darius and Xerxes. Those events did not belong to the lifetime of Cyrus, however, and they should not pull the narrative away from him. What matters at this stage is the changing scale of his responsibility. Cyrus now had to choose commanders capable of acting independently, develop ways of communicating with coastal cities, and accept that imperial control would not be equally direct everywhere. One place might be held firmly by a garrison, while another needed only to pay tribute and keep the roads secure. This flexibility did not emerge as a perfected system. It developed through trial, rebellion, and adjustment. After assigning the pacification of Asia Minor to Harpagus and other generals, Cyrus turned his attention away from the Aegean coast. Ancient sources do not provide a precise year-by-year schedule, but there is reason to believe that he conducted major eastern campaigns between the conquest of Lydia and the attack on Babylon in 539 before the Common Era. Under Darius, Bactria, Sogdiana, Arachosia, Drangiana, Gandhara, Parthia, Hyrcania, and many other territories appeared in the imperial lists. Cambyses II, who succeeded Cyrus, is not known to have made major conquests in that direction because his attention centered on Egypt. A substantial part of the expansion into Central Asia and the northwestern edge of the Indian subcontinent probably occurred under Cyrus. The farther east we look, however, the thinner the evidence becomes. Later, authors mention Chiropolis, the city of Cyrus, in Sogdiana, his attack on Kapisa, in what is now Afghanistan, and contact with communities near Gandhara. Not every location can be identified securely, and not every tradition is equally reliable. Modern maps easily create the impression that a single uniform color covered a territory as soon as an army passed through it. In reality, frontier power might consist of a few fortresses, the oaths of local leaders, control over important valleys, and the ability to punish communities that stopped paying tribute. Between those points, many groups retained considerable autonomy, especially in mountains, deserts, and steppe country. Cyrus had to confront a landscape very different from Lydia. In Anatolia, cities, agricultural roads, and concentrated treasuries created clear targets. In Central Asia, the distance between water sources could determine an army's route. Great rivers served as avenues of movement and barriers at the same time. Nomadic peoples did not necessarily defend a capital that an enemy could surround. They could withdraw into the interior, cut supply lines, and choose their moment to counterattack. To hold the frontier, the king needed forts, cavalry, local allies, and an understanding of the seasons. These poorly documented years may have occupied a substantial part of the reign of Cyrus, giving him experience against many forms of warfare while extending the empire toward limits that became increasingly difficult to manage. Every successful campaign also brought more people into the army and the court. Medes, Persians, Armenians, Lydians, Achaemenids, and Bactrians did not become a single people, but they could serve the same king. The army contained more than warriors. It needed horse handlers, weapons repairers, guides, interpreters, scribes, cooks, and long supply trains. When Cyrus appeared before a city, his strength did not rest only on the number of men carrying spears. It rested on his ability to make a broad network, provide food, animals, information, and reinforcements. This was the material foundation beneath the image of a conqueror whom legends often reduced to a few brilliant decisions. By the early 540s before the Common Era, Cyrus had traveled an almost unimaginable distance from the position he occupied in 559. He began as king of Anshan, defeated Astyages around 550, took Lydia around 547 or 546, and then extended his authority into eastern regions during the following years. Yet the wealthiest and most prestigious center in Western Asia still did not belong to him. Babylon, standing beside the Euphrates River, was more than the capital of an empire. It was a city of ancient temples, walls, palaces, canals, archives, scribes, and memories of kingship reaching across many dynasties. The ruler of Babylon could claim a status that victory on the Iranian plateau did not provide by itself. By the time Cyrus turned toward Mesopotamia, he was no longer a rebel against a former master. He had become the most dangerous rival of Nabonidus. Nabonidus came to the Babylonian throne in 556 before the Common Era, amid considerable turmoil at court. He did not descend directly from Nebuchadnezzar II, the king associated with the most celebrated period of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. His mother, Adad-Gupi, held an important religious position and, according to commemorative texts, lived to an exceptional age. Nabonidus showed particular devotion to the moon god Sin and to centers of worship associated with that deity, especially Haran. This later became a basis for hostile accounts that portrayed him as a king who neglected Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. His religious policies, however, were more complex than the image of a ruler simply opposed to the god of his capital. He restored many temples, took an interest in ancient inscriptions, and might even be described as a monarch fascinated by the recovery of the past. The greater problem was that Nabonidus left Babylon and lived for roughly a decade at Tama, an oasis in northern Arabia. His exact reasons remain disputed. He may have pursued commercial interests, sought control of the incense routes, followed a religious program, or responded to political conflict in the capital. During his absence, his son Belshazzar exercised important authority in Babylon, but apparently could not perform all the rites reserved for the king. The Akitu New Year festival, which was connected to Marduk and to the renewal of kingship, was not celebrated in its normal form during many of the years Nabonidus was away. For the priests and for people whose economic lives followed the ritual rhythms of the temples, this disruption had practical as well as symbolic consequences. Cyrus may have learned of these difficulties through merchants, envoys, deserters, and networks extending across Western Asia. His empire had approached Mesopotamia from several directions. After the eastern campaigns, he commanded a large force and controlled resources from Media, Lydia, and the Persian homeland. Yet entering Babylonia was different from attacking a kingdom organized around a single center. The Mesopotamian plain depended on rivers, canals, and walled cities. A failed campaign could weaken the reputation of Cyrus, encourage rebellion in recently conquered territories, and give his enemies time to assemble an alliance. He needed the political conditions inside Babylon to be as favorable as the military conditions outside it. Texts produced after the victory of Cyrus described Nabonidus in fiercely negative terms. He was accused of neglecting Marduk, bringing divine images from other cities into Babylon, imposing heavy labor, and overturning the proper order. Marduk was said to have searched throughout the lands for a righteous king before choosing Cyrus. This was not a neutral record. It belonged to a long tradition of propaganda in which a new ruler proved his legitimacy by declaring that the old king had failed in religion and morality. Cyrus did not necessarily compose every one of these claims himself. Babylonian priests and scribes understood the political language of their city and knew how a foreign conqueror had to be introduced if he was to become king of Babylon. Cooperation between the Persian court and people with local knowledge probably created an image suited to the transfer of power. Even so, it would be misleading to dismiss every criticism of Nabonidus as fiction. The king's absence, the interruption of the Achaemenid festival, and his preference for sin may have caused genuine resentment. Images of several gods were brought into Babylon before the Persian invasion, perhaps to protect them from the advancing army, but his enemies could interpret the act as an offense against cities deprived of their divine protectors. Labor requirements and military preparations may also have increased the burden on ordinary people. Cyrus did not create these divisions out of nothing. He exploited and directed them. The same pattern had appeared with Astyages when the Median army betrayed its king, and may also have mattered in Lydia, where dependent territories did not form a perfectly loyal bloc around Croesus. In 539 before the Common Era, the confrontation entered its final phase. Nabonidus had returned to Babylon, and the Achaemenid festival was once again celebrated, perhaps as an effort to restore legitimacy in the face of war. Images of the gods from several cities were concentrated in the capital. The Persian army advanced into the Diyala River Valley and then toward the Tigris. The decisive location was Opis, a city on the river north of Babylon. The Nabonidus Chronicle states briefly that Cyrus fought the army of Akkad, that the Babylonian forces withdrew, and that killing followed. The passage is short and its exact translation remains debated, but it is enough to reject the image of an entire conquest accomplished without violence. We do not know how Cyrus deployed his forces at Opis, whether Nabonidus commanded in person, or how many warriors stood on either side. Detailed descriptions by Greek authors were written later and do not agree with the chronicle. It is more responsible to focus on the result. The Babylonian army suffered a serious defeat, organized resistance in the north collapsed, and the road into the alluvial plain lay open. If Cyrus wanted to be welcomed as a restorer of peace, the violence at Opis was not something he had reason to emphasize in the texts celebrating his triumph. The silence of the Cyrus cylinder does not make the battle disappear. It shows only that the king wanted the Babylonians to remember the preservation of their city rather than the price paid before his army reached its gates. On October 10, 539 before the Common Era, according to the conversion most often used, Sippar fell to the Persians without a major battle. Nabonidus fled. 2 days later, on October 12, an army commanded by Ugbaru, governor of Gutium, and a servant of Cyrus entered Babylon. The chronicle says that the city was taken without fighting and that temple rites were not interrupted. Temple gates were guarded, military discipline was maintained, and scheduled ceremonies continued. Cyrus did not personally enter the city at once. He arrived on October 29th, more than 2 weeks after his forces had taken control of Babylon. The delay appears to have allowed time for ceremonial preparation, security arrangements, and decisions about how the new king would be presented. An entrance into an ancient capital was more than an army passing through a gate. Clothing, the order of the procession, formal statements, offerings, and the people who came out to meet the ruler all carried meaning. Cyrus needed to appear not as a mountain chieftain arriving to plunder, but as the rightful king of Babylon. Ugbaru and local officials had time to preserve order, while Nabonidus was captured in Babylon after he had fled. New administrators were appointed, and soldiers were prevented from violating the temples. When Cyrus finally entered, the victorious account described peace, rejoicing, and a greeting offered to him. Herodotus tells a different story. In his account, Babylon trusted its walls and food reserves and prepared for a long resistance. Cyrus ordered channels dug or used existing canals to lower the Euphrates, after which his soldiers entered along the riverbed while the inhabitants celebrated a festival. Xenophon also describes a nighttime entry by way of the water, accompanied by fighting inside the city. These accounts created the familiar image of the Persians diverting the Euphrates. The Babylonian chronicle, however, was written closer to the event and says that the army of Ugbaru took the city without a battle. Some manipulation of water may have occurred, or the Greek tradition may have combined knowledge of Babylonian geography with a familiar story of deception. There is not enough evidence to present the diversion of the river as confirmed fact. To the residents of Babylon, the morning after the takeover probably did not feel like a complete ending. Bakers still needed flour, canal workers still had to regulate water, merchants inspected goods, priests prepared rituals, scribes drafted contracts, and farmers thought about the coming season. Daily work could not stop simply because the title at the top of the political system had changed. The presence of a new army must have caused anxiety, but the protection of temples and economic activity made the transfer of power less chaotic. On clay tablets, the reign of Nabonidus ended, and the regnal years of Cyrus began to date documents. Empire changed through administrative details like these, not only through the sight of a king entering a city gate. Nabonidus was captured, but his later fate is not entirely clear. Some traditions say that Cyrus spared him and allowed him to live in exile, while others suggest a different ending. As with Astyages and Croesus, the image of Cyrus is often associated with preserving the life of a defeated king. This may reflect a real policy, since a former ruler under supervision could sometimes be more useful than a dead man transformed into a symbol of resistance. Yet the repeated perfection of the pattern in literature also requires caution. Cyrus could use mercy when it served stability, but he was not bound by a modern principle that prohibited every form of punishment. The people who resisted him at Opis, in Lydia and in Ionia, experienced violence more directly than the kings in stories of clemency. The capture of Babylon once again transformed the scale of Cyrus's power. He took control not only of the city, but of much of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, Mesopotamia, Syria, Phoenicia, and regions west of the Euphrates gradually acknowledged Persian authority. On the Cyrus Cylinder, the king states that rulers from the Upper Sea to the Lower Sea brought tribute to Babylon, language suggesting a world stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the Persian Gulf. By about 535 before the Common Era, a broad administrative region encompassing Babylonia and the territory beyond the river had been organized under Persian rule. The imperial frontier reached the border of Egypt, but Egypt remained independent during the lifetime of Cyrus and was conquered only later by Cambyses II. This was the moment when the titles of Cyrus changed most dramatically. In the Babylonian text, he called himself King of the World, Great King, Mighty King, King of Babylon, King of Sumer and Akkad, and King of the Four Quarters. These titles were not invented merely to satisfy the personal pride of one man. They belonged to the established language of Mesopotamian kingship and had been used by earlier dynasties. By accepting them, Cyrus stepped into a role the Babylonians already understood. At the same time, he recalled his origin as king of Anshan, son of Cambyses, grandson of Cyrus, and descendant of a family that had always possessed kingship. Two traditions stood side by side, his Persian lineage and his claim to the Babylonian succession. The most famous text associated with this moment is the Cyrus cylinder, a barrel-shaped clay object inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform. It was found in Babylon in 1879 during excavations conducted by Hormuzd Rassam for the British Museum. Its form was not entirely new. Mesopotamian kings often placed building inscriptions within the foundations or walls of structures in order to record their work, seek divine protection, and leave messages for future rulers. The Cyrus cylinder was probably buried in the foundation of a city wall after Cyrus took Babylon and carried out repairs. It was not a public tablet displayed in a square for every citizen to read, and it certainly was not a constitution in the modern sense. The opening section speaks about Nabonidus in the third person. He is presented as an unworthy ruler who interrupted offerings, offended the gods, and burdened the population. Marduk took pity on Babylon, searched every land for a righteous ruler, and then called Cyrus king of Anshan by name. The god led Cyrus to victory, caused peoples to submit, and allowed him to enter Babylon without destroying the city. The text then shifts into the voice of Cyrus. He lists his titles and ancestry, claims that he brought peace, describes his care for the worship of Marduk, says that he returned divine images to their cities, and declares that displaced communities were restored to their homes. The final section refers to construction, offerings, and the city walls. The text shows us how Cyrus wanted to be seen. He did not tell the Babylonians that their gods were meaningless or that every local tradition had to give way to a Persian religion. Instead, he allowed himself to be presented as the ruler chosen by Marduk. This does not prove that Cyrus secretly converted to Babylonian religion. Almost no reliable evidence survives about his personal beliefs. Some scholars have argued that Cyrus followed an early form of Zoroastrianism and worshipped Ahura Mazda, while others consider the evidence insufficient. The Cyrus cylinder reveals royal policy in Babylon. It does not open a direct window into the private spiritual life of the king. The return of divine images to their temples carried great importance in the Mesopotamian setting. These statues were more than works of art. Each was regarded as the presence of a god within a community and was cared for through ritual and offerings. When Nabonidus gathered many of them in Babylon, he may have intended to protect them from the invasion. For the cities from which they had been removed, however, the absence of a divine protector could create a feeling that the proper order had been broken. Cyrus returned the images and sent a message that the new dynasty respected the relationship between a city and its god. The policy helped him win the support of temples, institutions that owned land, directed labor, stored wealth, and exercised deep influence over society. In later times, the Cyrus cylinder has sometimes been promoted as the first declaration of human rights. The label is attractive because the text speaks of peace, the restoration of temples, and the return of displaced people. Yet it applies a modern concept to an ancient royal inscription. The cylinder does not declare that all people are born equal, establish universal rights for citizens, or limit the authority of the king through a law that subjects could invoke against him. Cyrus remained a conqueror who demanded tribute, used armies, and ruled as an absolute monarch by the standards of his age. The real value of the document does not need exaggeration. It reveals a meaningful contrast with the large-scale forced migrations practiced by many earlier dynasties and presents a method of legitimizing rule through restoration rather than through displays of destruction alone. To understand Cyrus through the cylinder, we must recognize both policy and propaganda. Propaganda does not necessarily mean that every statement is false. A king could persuade people over time only if his actions corresponded at least partly to the image being promoted. Divine statues were in fact returned. Temple activity continued. Some communities were allowed to return or re-establish life in their former homes. Babylon appears to have avoided a large-scale sack, sparing the city the fate suffered by many other capitals. Yet the text also selected what should be remembered and what should be forgotten. It celebrated a peaceful entry but did not mention the bloodshed at Opis. It described Nabonidus as the cause of every disorder without acknowledging his achievements or the complex reasoning behind his policies. It cast Cyrus in the role of the savior Babylon was supposed to have awaited. The memory of the exiled people of Judah gave the image of Cyrus a special dimension. In 587 or 586 before the Common Era, decades before his capture of Babylon, Jerusalem was destroyed by the army of Nebuchadnezzar II, and part of the population of Judah was taken to Mesopotamia. Not everyone left the homeland, and those who reached Babylonia did not all live under the same conditions. Over time, they raised families, participated in economic life, and preserved a religious identity in their new surroundings. When Cyrus took Babylon in 539, the Persian court allowed displaced groups to return and supported the restoration of local centers of worship. This broader policy opened the possibility of rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. The Book of Ezra preserves two forms of the decree: a proclamation in Hebrew at the beginning of the book and an administrative memorandum in Aramaic in chapter 6. The ending of 2 Chronicles also repeats language close to the Hebrew proclamation. Scholars continue to debate the details of the return, the timing of reconstruction, and the extent of Cyrus's direct involvement, but the central tradition fits the policy of temple restoration known from Babylon. Particularly striking is the way Isaiah describes Cyrus. A foreign king is presented as the Lord's anointed, a shepherd, and an instrument of divine purpose. Within the thought of the community of Judah, Cyrus did not need to become a worshipper of Yahweh in order to be used by Yahweh. He was judged by actions that opened the way for restoration. Placed side by side, the two traditions create a rare image. For the Babylonian scribe, Marduk found Cyrus and led him into the city. For the Hebrew author, Yahweh took Cyrus by the hand to subdue nations and permit the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Each community interpreted the same king through its own theological language. This did not necessarily result from Cyrus designing a separate ideology for every people. Local communities could explain events through their own beliefs, while Persian policy remained flexible enough to allow different explanations to coexist. In separate texts, Cyrus became a ruler who could be chosen by several gods because he did not force communities to abandon their own understanding of sacred authority. This does not mean that every exile immediately returned or that every community in the empire received complete freedom. A long journey required resources, organization, and a willingness to leave places where some families had lived for decades. Many people remained in Babylonia. The rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem took years and encountered serious difficulties under later kings. The empire still decided who would receive official recognition, how land would be administered, and what tribute had to be paid. Cyrus opened a political door, but the life beyond that door was built by later generations. Respecting this complexity makes his achievement more credible, not less important. In the years after 539 before the Common Era, Cyrus had to move from conquest to the administration of a territory too large for one person to observe directly. From the Aegean coast to Sogdiana and from the Caucasus south to Babylonia and Syria, distance meant more than days on the road. Every region used its own languages, legal customs, religious calendars, and methods of record-keeping. In Babylon, contracts were inscribed on clay in cuneiform. Elsewhere, Aramaic played an increasingly important role in administrative communication. In the Persian homeland, Elamite traditions remained influential. The Greek cities preserved their institutions and writing. A command had meaning only when someone could translate it, record it, carry it, and possess enough authority to make it effective. Cyrus did not destroy all these systems and replace them with a single uniform administration. He continued to use Babylonian managers, local scribes, temples, client kings, and community leaders as long as they accepted his supremacy. In Phoenicia, maritime cities retained local kings and fleets. In Ionia, communities preserved many forms of local government, although they often came under the influence of rulers backed by Persia. On the frontiers, authority could rest on relations with local leaders and military garrisons. Government did not look the same everywhere because Cyrus had neither the reason nor the resources to make it the same. The office of satrap, usually translated as provincial governor, became closely associated with the Achaemenid Empire, but the fully developed provincial system of Darius should not be projected backward onto Cyrus. Cyrus did use governors and administrative districts. Ugbaru and Gubaru appear as separate names in the Babylonian setting, while generals exercised authority in Lydia. The formal division of provinces, fixed levels of tribute, construction of the royal road, development of the Daric coin, and deeper standardization are more clearly associated with Darius I after 522 before the Common Era. The achievement of Cyrus was to establish the political foundation and keep his conquests stable enough for a successor to systematize them. The demands of the central court on local regions can be summarized in a few words: loyalty, tribute or taxes, soldiers, supplies, and security along the roads. Behind those short terms stood a long chain of activity. Grain had to be harvested, measured, moved into storage, and issued to armies. Horses required pasture, handlers, and replacements. Metal passed through the hands of craftspeople before becoming weapons. Messengers needed stations and fresh animals in order to maintain speed. Royal gifts had to be produced, packed, and distributed. Temples did more than pray. They also managed fields, herds, and workers. The empire existed through the daily labor of thousands of people who never met Cyrus. For a Babylonian farmer, Persian rule might be felt through an official collecting part of the harvest, a labor obligation, or the condition of an irrigation canal, rather than through an image of the king. For a Lydian merchant, the change might lie in the people guarding the roads, the units used in payment, or the official who settled a dispute. For a Median nobleman, the new dynasty offered an opportunity to remain in service if loyalty could be demonstrated. For a soldier from a distant province, the name Cyrus was associated with rations, plunder, and orders to march. These experiences were not the same. A policy that benefited a priest whose divine image had been returned did not necessarily reduce the burden on a man called into military service. The reputation of Cyrus for tolerance should therefore be understood as a relatively flexible form of rule, not as evidence that every subject lived an easy life. Preserving local systems also had disadvantages. When a local figure became too powerful or changed sides, the court had to intervene. The revolt of Pactyes in Lydia had already shown the danger. Newly conquered regions might submit while the army was present, and then become less loyal once the king moved away. Cyrus needed a network of relatives, noblemen, and generals whose interests were tied to the dynasty. Gifts, marriages, offices, and access to the king became political tools. Violence remained behind the negotiation. A city knew that if it stopped paying tribute, the army could return. It was this combination of compromise and the ability to punish that held the broad structure together. The personal reputation of Cyrus probably mattered greatly. Herodotus says that later Persians called him a father, while they regarded Darius as a merchant because of his tax system and remembered Cambyses as a harsh master. This comparison was written through a Greek lens and cannot speak for every Persian, but it suggests that Cyrus was remembered as a ruler closely associated with the founding generation. Founders often hold an advantage in memory. The problems of a mature system are blamed on those who come later, while the first victories become surrounded by a feeling of unity. Cyrus also knew how to create personal relationships with members of the elite and make them view his success as an opportunity for themselves. Xenophon transformed that reputation into an art of leadership. In the Cyropedia, Cyrus observed what each person wanted, presented rewards in public, shared danger, and encouraged his followers to compete for recognition. The work cannot prove that the historical Cyrus spoke every line Xenophon gave him, but it offers a reasonable insight. No one could build such an empire through fear alone. An army might force a fortress to open its gates. To govern for decades, a king needed people willing to work for advantage, honor, or the belief that service would raise them to a higher position. Personal magnetism, even if later generations exaggerated it, was probably part of the success of Cyrus. At the same time, war remained a foundation that cannot be concealed. Cyrus inherited the throne of Anshan but became a great king by defeating Astyages, Croesus, the Ionian cities, eastern communities, and the Babylonian army at Opis. Those who resisted could be killed, captured, or deprived of property. Cities had to supply resources to a distant court. His tolerance did not eliminate coercion. It operated after the balance of power had been decided. If Cyrus is presented only as a liberator, we forget the people who experienced the Persian army from the other side. If he is described only as an invader, we cannot explain why many communities accepted and even praised the new authority. The historical man stands between those simple images. As the power of Cyrus expanded, his private life became even harder to see. Royal texts cared about titles, ancestors, gods, and construction, rather than the people who ate with the king or the way he spoke with his children. Greek authors provide the names of relatives, but often place them inside stories designed to teach political lessons. His best-known wife was Cassandae, daughter of Pharnaspes, and a member of the Achaemenid line. Herodotus says that Cyrus loved her more than any other wife and ordered the entire empire to mourn after her death. A passage in the Nabonidus Chronicle records the death of the king's wife, and a period of public mourning in Babylonia from the end of the month Adar into the beginning of Nisan, corresponding approximately to March 538 before the Common Era. Many scholars identify this woman as Cassandae, but the text does not give her name, so the identification must remain cautious. If that identification is correct, Cassandae died not long after the conquest of Babylon. At the height of Cyrus's power, his family experienced a loss announced across the empire. Public mourning in Babylon also shows that events within the Persian royal household had entered the official rhythm of the newly conquered land. We do not know, however, whether Cassandae accompanied Cyrus on campaign or lived mainly at Pasargadae, whether she participated in political decisions or supported temples, and we cannot recreate private conversations between them. From one statement by Herodotus and one line in a chronicle, we can recognize only that she held a special position and that her death mattered beyond the royal family. Cassandain bore Cyrus two well-attested sons, Cambyses and Bardia, as well as the daughters Atossa and Artistone, and perhaps another daughter named Roxane. Their lives show that the dynasty did not end with its founder. Cambyses II would succeed his father and lead the Persian army into Egypt. Bardia would become the central figure in the crisis of 522 before the Common Era, although whether the man overthrown by Darius was the real Bardia or a Magian impostor remains a difficult question. Atossa passed through several royal marriages before becoming the wife of Darius I and the mother of Xerxes I. Artistone also married Darius. Through them, the bloodline of Cyrus remained at the center of Achaemenid authority, even when the branch of Darius held the throne. In ancient royal families, blood relationships could not be separated from politics. Sons were heirs, but they could also become rivals. Daughters were married in order to connect branches of a dynasty, strengthen claims to legitimacy, and reconcile groups with power. A royal marriage was more than a private choice, even when affection was present. Cyrus gained his empire by bringing Persians and Medes together and absorbing different traditions. His family later helped his successors present themselves as continuations of the founder. Darius, who was not a son of Cyrus, could strengthen his position through marriage to women from the family of Cyrus. The prestige of the founder thus became a political asset that outlived his body. Cyrus probably introduced Cambyses to the work of government before the succession. After the capture of Babylon, the name of Cambyses appeared in connection with New Year ceremonies. The Nabonidus Chronicle describes him taking part in a temple ritual while wearing clothing the scribe identified as Elamite, although the damaged text leaves the exact meaning unclear. Some documents led scholars to argue that Cambyses was made king of Babylon or joint ruler for a short time, but this interpretation is not completely certain. What can be said is that Cyrus presented his eldest son in the most important political center of the empire, preparing Babylonian elites to recognize the man likely to inherit the throne. The preparation served a practical purpose. The empire had been built around the reputation of Cyrus, but it could not depend forever on his ability to travel personally to every region. As the king grew older, the succession became urgent. A political vacuum might cause Lydia to rebel, Babylon to seek independence, Central Asian leaders to abandon their oaths, and Persian nobles to divide into factions. Cyrus needed to designate an heir early enough for the army, the royal family, and imperial officials to understand the order that would follow his death. Cambyses was the obvious choice, but Bardia also possessed substantial status. Later sources say that Cyrus gave Bardia authority over certain eastern regions or exempted those areas from tribute, but those details come from traditions shaped by later disputes and are difficult to verify. We cannot know what Cyrus was like as a father. His preparation of Cambyses for the throne demonstrates dynastic responsibility, but does not prove emotional closeness. Later stories about Cambyses, especially those told by Herodotus, describe the son as unstable and cruel, creating a contrast with the wise Cyrus. The difference may have been exaggerated to create a lesson about decline from the founding generation to its heir. Cambyses achieved major victories and demonstrated the ability to organize the Egyptian campaign, so he should not be seen only through this negative portrait. If Cyrus trained his son to receive a vast empire, at least part of that preparation succeeded. After 530 before the Common Era, Cambyses took the throne without immediately losing the lands his father had conquered. Cyrus was around 60 when he captured Babylon and had already lived longer than many warriors of his age. Life expectancy in the ancient world does not mean that most people died before the age of 30. High childhood mortality lowered the average, while those who survived youth could live for many decades. Even so, a life of continuous campaigning placed heavy demands on the body. Cyrus traveled across plateaus, deserts, plains, and great rivers, facing heat, cold, illness, and the danger of injury. The king had better protection than an ordinary soldier, including tents, servants, physicians, and reliable food, but he was not immune to the conditions experienced by his army. His continued personal involvement in campaigns late in life shows that early Achaemenid kingship remained closely tied to military command. Cyrus could not simply remain in Babylon or Pasargadae and expect his titles to keep every frontier obedient. A king who built his reputation through victory had to demonstrate that he could defend territory and distribute rewards. If Cyrus delegated every campaign while staying in the palace, a successful general might accumulate too much influence. If the king was present, plunder and loyalty gathered around him. That was an advantage, but it also tied the fate of the empire to the risks of the battlefield. The court of Cyrus probably moved among several centers. Pasargadae was the capital associated with his homeland and dynasty. Ecbatana remained important because of its location and climate. Susa stood between the traditions of Elam and the routes connecting the plateau with Mesopotamia. Babylon was an administrative, religious, and economic center Cyrus could not ignore. The modern idea of a single capital, therefore, does not fit completely. The king, his family, the treasury, and the administration could move with the seasons and the demands of politics. Each center allowed Cyrus to appear in a different role. Persian king at Pasargadae, successor to Media at Ecbatana, and king of Babylon beside the Euphrates. The movement of the court displayed power and created burdens at the same time. Hundreds or thousands of travelers needed housing, food, animals, wagons, protection, and stored supplies. Local regions had to prepare before the king arrived. Messengers reported on the road, officials gathered tribute, and cooks and craftspeople served the royal party. A court was more than a permanent building. It was also a network of people who traveled with the ruler. Cyrus learned to maintain that network on the scale of Anshan and then enlarged it with the resources of Media, Lydia, and Babylon. The gardens of Pasargadae and the ceremonies of Babylon were the visible parts of a far greater logistical system. Within that system, gifts held special importance. The king awarded bracelets, clothing, weapons, horses, land, or administrative authority in recognition of service. Recipients brought tribute, valuable objects, skilled people, and oaths of loyalty. The exchange was unequal because Cyrus stood at the top, but it turned power into a specific relationship. A nobleman understood his status through his place at a banquet, his access to the king, and the gift presented to him before others. Xenophon emphasized the skill of Cyrus in observing and rewarding his followers. Although individual examples cannot be verified, a multinational court required this art of distribution if it was to prevent competition from becoming division. Language was a challenge that stories of war often overlook. We do not know with certainty which language Cyrus used in daily life, but he came from a Persian environment and may have encountered Median, Elamite, and other languages. In Babylon, his words were written in Akkadian. In communication across regions, Aramaic became increasingly useful. Interpreters did more than replace one word with another. They explained titles, ceremonies, and political meaning. A command expressed in the wrong way could offend a temple, cause an ally to misunderstand, or make a concession look like weakness. The ability of the empire to govern in many languages depended on intermediaries whose names were rarely recorded. The religion of Cyrus must also be viewed through these layers of mediation. In Babylon, he honored Marduk through official language. In the tradition of Judah, Yahweh gave him a mission. In the Persian homeland, ritual may have involved Iranian deities and the Magi. Structures at Pasargadae have been connected to fire worship or outdoor ceremony, but identifying Cyrus as a Zoroastrian in the sense of a clearly developed later system remains controversial. The lifetime of Zarathustra, the spread of his teachings at court, and the way the name Ahura Mazda was used under Cyrus all remain uncertain. Darius later named Ahura Mazda explicitly in his inscriptions. Cyrus left no comparable Persian text that would allow the same conclusion. This uncertainty matters because practical policy did not necessarily arise from a single theological principle. Cyrus may have sincerely honored the gods of his homeland while believing that respect for Marduk was one of his duties as king of Babylon. In the ancient world, acknowledging the divine powers of another region did not always require abandoning one's own. Kingship often took different forms in different places. Restoring temples could fit a genuine belief that sacred order had to be preserved while also serving a political strategy that reduced resistance. Dividing his motives too sharply into sincere and calculating would impose modern categories on a king who lived more than 25 centuries ago. The years from 538 to about 531 before the Common Era were less dramatic in the surviving sources than the great conquests, but they may have been decisive for the durability of the empire. Cyrus no longer needed to prove that he could capture a capital. He had to demonstrate that a land continued to function after its ruler changed. Babylonian economic documents continued to be issued under his regnal years. Temples remained active, officials were appointed, the western territories were arranged, and the court watched distant frontiers. The absence of a major recorded rebellion in Babylon during his lifetime does not mean that everyone was satisfied, but it shows that the transfer of power achieved a considerable degree of stability. In Phoenicia, coastal cities such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos possessed their own traditions of seafaring, trade, and kingship. Cyrus had no reason to destroy their fleets. The empire benefited when their ships continued to trade and later served royal campaigns. In Syria and Palestine, urban communities, agricultural villages, temples, and local networks were placed beneath a new level of authority, while many older structures survived. In Babylonia, fields, canals, and merchant families generated economic strength. In Lydia, silver and access to the sea offered different forms of value. Cyrus did not force all these resources into a single pattern. He profited by allowing each region to continue doing what it already knew, provided that the results flowed toward the court and the political order was not challenged. Relative stability also allowed people and materials to move. Stoneworkers from Anatolia could contribute their skills to Persian royal projects. Artistic motifs traveled across regions. Goods from India or Central Asia passed through chains of exchange to Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean, while Western products moved in the opposite direction. Cyrus did not create every commercial route. Many had existed for generations. The empire placed them under a broader authority that could protect one section of a road and demand taxes on another. Political unity did not eliminate banditry, weather, or local war, but it changed the scale on which merchants and officials could imagine movement. Cyrus did not create the famous gold daric, which is generally associated with Darius I. After conquering Lydia, the Persians gained access to a region that had adopted metal coinage early, and they may have continued to circulate or mint forms of currency based on local traditions. Most of the imperial economy, however, did not depend entirely on coins. Weighed silver, grain, oil, livestock, labor, and other goods all served in exchange and in the fulfillment of obligations. This distinction prevents us from imagining that Cyrus immediately unified the currency of his entire realm. His career marked the beginning of a process. The standardization for which the Achaemenid Empire became famous developed more clearly under later kings. The same is true of the royal road from Susa to Sardis. It often appears in accounts of the Persian Empire, but the form described by Herodotus is more closely connected to the system under Darius. Cyrus certainly used and protected older routes because military campaigns could not be directed without them. He may have improved stations, bridges, river crossings, and methods of communication, but the evidence does not allow the entire completed network to be credited to him alone. This distinction does not reduce his importance. Founders rarely finish every institution later associated with their state. His success lay in creating the political space in which further reforms became possible. When Cyrus is compared with Alexander, a striking difference gradually appears. Alexander advanced more quickly and defeated the Achaemenid Empire in less than a decade, but he died in 323 before the Common Era at the age of 32, leaving an empire that rapidly divided among his generals. Cyrus expanded more slowly over almost 3 decades, taking time to integrate Media, Lydia, the eastern territories, and Babylon before preparing his son to succeed him. The comparison is not meant to declare one man greater than the other. It shows that conquest and the construction of a dynasty are different measures of achievement. Alexander inherited many structures created by Cyrus and his successors, just as Cyrus had inherited the experience of Assyria, Babylon, Media, and Elam. There are also similarities and differences between Cyrus and Genghis Khan. Both rose from landscapes regarded as peripheral by settled centers, gathered groups of warriors, and expanded across many cultures. Both depended on skilled people drawn from conquered communities, yet their military systems, environments, eras, and social structures differed so greatly that Cyrus should not be turned into an early Genghis Khan. Cyrus is also remembered for tolerance in a way that invites comparison with Ashoka, but there is no evidence that he underwent a moral transformation after war like the one associated with Ashoka and Kalinga. A comparison is useful only when it clarifies Cyrus rather than hiding him beneath the shadow of another famous ruler. The distinct quality of Cyrus lay in a continuous series of adaptations. Among the Medes, he inherited a court and retained members of the elite. In Lydia, he took over a treasury and a network of cities, but had to correct his policy after the revolt of Pactyes. In Babylon, he assumed the titles and obligations of a Mesopotamian king. For the community of Judah, the policy of temple restoration was remembered as a religious turning point. On the Central Asian frontier, power depended more heavily on fortresses and military force. No single formula was applied everywhere. This flexibility made the empire seem less uniform, but it was precisely the lack of uniformity that allowed it to expand. By the final years of his life, Cyrus had become a figure his younger self could scarcely have imagined. Messengers arrived from many lands, gifts filled royal storehouses, scribes worked in several languages, and his children were being prepared for a future far beyond Anshan. Yet that scale created constant pressure. The longer a frontier became, the more places had to be defended. Success in the west did not remove danger in the east. Nomadic and semi-nomadic communities beyond Persian control did not see the world as a court map. They followed pastures, water, feuds, alliances, and opportunities for raiding. A fortress built by Cyrus protected a route, but also became a target. Instead of spending his old age inside a palace, the king turned once more toward Central Asia. No source tells us exactly where the meeting that led to his final campaign took place. We do not know whether Cyrus received a report of a raid, wanted to extend his territory again, or believed that the defeat of a frontier alliance was necessary to protect Bactria and Sogdiana. Ancient authors used names such as Pasargadae, Dahe, and Derbaces, but their geographical and ethnic terms do not always match modern classifications. These peoples lived across the steppe, deserts and river basins east of the Caspian Sea. They could move with the seasons, herd horses and livestock, fight with cavalry and bows, and trade with settled communities. Calling all of them barbarians merely repeats the prejudice of authors who lived in urban societies. For the empire, the northeastern frontier was not a continuous line marked by posts. It was a zone of contact. Merchants crossed it, herds moved through it, leaders formed and abandoned alliances, garrisons protected river passages, and outside groups entered imperial territory when conditions on the pasture changed. Cyrus built, or was later associated with, fortresses in Sogdiana. These structures protected valleys but also declared that the land now belonged within the domain of the great king. Any community that had used the same territory without acknowledging Persian authority possessed a reason to resist. The final campaign was therefore not an adventure into an empty part of the map. It arose from the collision between two different ways of using space. Before his departure, Cyrus had to arrange the succession. Herodotus says that he appointed Cambyses as king and entrusted him with the empire, while Bardia received a position of considerable importance in the east. The sources do not agree on the details, but the rapid succession of Cambyses shows that the central decision had been communicated. Cyrus may have taken trusted nobles and military units with him while leaving the heir at the center. If the campaign succeeded, the prestige of the dynasty would grow. If the king did not return, an administration had to be ready to continue. At this moment, Cyrus acted not only as a general, but as the founder of a state that needed to outlive him. Herodotus provides the fullest account of the campaign. According to him, the opponent was the Pasargadae, ruled by Queen Tamiris after the death of her husband. Cyrus first offered marriage, but Tamiris understood that he wanted her kingdom rather than a wife, and refused. The Persian king then prepared to cross a great river, usually identified with the Araxes, although the exact geography remains disputed. Tamiris sent a message proposing that either side withdraw from the bank and permit the other to advance before fighting on chosen ground. Cyrus called a council. Croesus, in the tradition that preserved the life of the Lydian king, advised him to cross into the land of the Pasargadae rather than allow them to enter the empire. The advice carries a clear moral purpose within the story. Croesus, who had misread an oracle and lost his kingdom, now reminded Cyrus that no human being remains fortunate forever. He proposed leaving behind a camp filled with rich food and wine, which the Pasargadae were said not to know. A section of the enemy force under Pasargadae, the son of Tamiris, captured the camp, ate and drank, and then lost its vigilance. The Persians returned and seized many prisoners. When Pasargadae regained his senses and understood his position, he asked to be unbound and then ended his own life. Tamiris swore revenge, assembled her forces, and met Cyrus in a battle Herodotus called the fiercest ever fought between non-Greek peoples. The ending of this version is famous for its symbolic force. The Persian army was defeated, Cyrus died, and Tamiris fulfilled her promise to give the man who thirsted for power his fill of blood. The detail fits the moral design of the entire account. The king, who had conquered too much, finally failed to stop. He used a deception involving wine and was punished by a queen defending her son and her people. Herodotus did not conceal that he knew several other stories about the death of Cyrus, and simply selected the one he considered most credible. The very source that made Tamiris famous therefore warns the reader that this was not the only surviving testimony. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing centuries later, said that Cyrus died while fighting the Dahae. Ctesias claimed that he fought the Derbaces, was wounded by the weapon of a warrior whose people had allies from India, and died several days later after Persian reinforcements finally turned the battle. Xenophon offered a completely different ending. His Cyrus died peacefully at home, summoned his children, spoke about the soul, and gave instructions for his burial. This ending served the purpose of the Cyropedia. An ideal ruler completed his life with wisdom and transferred power in an orderly way. It may preserve an element of Persian tradition, but it cannot be preferred simply because it is less tragic. Babylonian administrative texts help limit the date without revealing the circumstances. Cyrus died in 530 before the Common Era. Some documents continued to be dated by his reign until fairly late in the year, while early tablets of Cambyses appeared afterward. News required time to travel from Central Asia to Babylon, and the system scribes used to count years may not reflect the precise day of death. Proposals placing his death in the summer or toward the end of 530, therefore, do not entirely agree. What is certain is that Cyrus was dead by the end of that year, and Cambyses had become his successor. Viewed across his whole career, the possibility that Cyrus died on the eastern frontier is consistent with the life he had lived. He built power by appearing wherever the political order remained unstable. From the rebellion against Media to the pursuit of Croesus, the Central Asian campaigns, and the advance into Babylonia, Cyrus was not a king who merely received reports. His final years did not change that pattern, yet a method of government based on military presence created dangers that diplomacy could not remove. An arrow, a spear, a fall from a horse, an infection, or a battle accepted at the wrong moment could end the life of the man ruling the largest empire of his age. We cannot know what Cyrus said during his final hours. The speeches written by Xenophon are beautiful, but they belong to literature. The vow of Thamyris is powerful, but it comes to us through Herodotus. The silence of contemporary evidence does not permit us to construct a scene in which the king reviewed his life or confessed regret. A more honest narrative allows the empty space to remain. Somewhere in the east, around 530 before the Common Era, the man who had carried an army from southern Iran to the Aegean and Babylon died. His followers then had to protect his body if they could, send the news along distant roads, and make sure the order of succession was enforced before a rival could exploit the moment. The body of Cyrus was eventually buried at Pasargadae. If he truly died deep inside enemy territory, as Herodotus claimed, the Persians must have recovered him and carried him home across a great distance. Ctesias says that Cambyses sent a man named Bagapates to escort the body to its resting place. That detail is not entirely secure, but ancient sources consistently associate the tomb at Pasargadae with Cyrus. It stands alone on the plain, separated from the palaces and gardens, a building simple in outline but assembled from enormous blocks of stone fitted together with great precision. Its base consists of 6 receding stone steps. At the top stands a burial chamber with a sloping roof and a low, narrow entrance. The entire structure rises approximately 11 meters, modest, beside the pyramids of Egypt or the later palace platforms at Persepolis. Simplicity did not mean that it was inexpensive. Quarrying, transporting, cutting, and fitting the stones demanded highly skilled labor. The form of the tomb combines elements that may be connected to local traditions, Anatolia, and the wider world Cyrus brought into his empire. Like the palaces at Pasargadae, it did not simply copy one region. It created a new language from several sources. Arrian and Strabo, writing much later and drawing on reports from the companions of Alexander the Great, described the interior. According to them, it once contained a golden coffin, a bed or couch with golden feet, Babylonian tapestries, robes, Median-style trousers, jewelry, and weapons. A group of magi was assigned to care for the tomb and received provisions for that duty. None of these objects survives for archaeologists to examine. The tomb was said to have been violated and robbed even in antiquity. Yet the list of clothing from several regions fits the image of a ruler who combined Persian, Median, and Babylonian traditions even in his burial. Later writers also preserved an inscription said to have stood on the tomb, "Pasargadae, I am Cyrus, son of Cambyses, founder of the Persian Empire and once king of Asia. Do not begrudge me this small piece of earth." No such words survive on the structure, and funerary inscriptions are not a securely established feature of early Achaemenid royal tombs. The companions of Alexander may have confused the supposed epitaph with other inscriptions at Pasargadae, or a later tradition may have created a statement suited to the tomb's simplicity. The idea that a man who once possessed many lands ultimately required only a small stone room is philosophically powerful, but the words should not be placed in the mouth of Cyrus as a confirmed quotation. The death of the founder became the first test of the empire. Cambyses II took the throne in 530 before the Common Era. There is no evidence of an immediate major civil war, suggesting that the succession had been prepared effectively. Media, Lydia, and Babylon did not all break away. Officials who had served Cyrus began dating records by the reign of his son. The army recognized a new commander. This does not mean that the transfer was peaceful in every place, but the structure did not dissolve like an alliance held together by one individual alone. Cambyses inherited great ambition and immense resources. Egypt remained the independent power of the southwest, may once have maintained contact with Croesus, and posed a threat to Persian authority in the Levant. In 525 before the Common Era, Cambyses defeated Pharaoh Psamtik III at Pelusium and then captured Memphis. Egypt became part of the empire. That success is sometimes included on maps of the Empire of Cyrus, leading viewers to assume that Cyrus personally ruled the Nile Valley. The chronology must preserve the boundary between the two reigns. Cyrus carried Persian power to the Egyptian frontier, but Cambyses completed the conquest. Greek sources, especially Herodotus, portrayed Cambyses in Egypt as a man who gradually lost control, insulted local religion, and killed members of his own family. Modern scholarship shows that this image was shaped by hostile traditions and cannot be accepted in full. Cambyses still used the titles of a pharaoh, took part in ceremonies, and relied on Egyptian officials. He may have met resistance and used violence, but he was not simply the absolute opposite of a tolerant father. The stronger the memory of Cyrus became as a good king, the easier it was to transform his son into a contrasting figure. The comparison tells us as much about the way memory selects characters as it does about the complete reality of either reign. The true crisis broke out in 522 before the Common Era. According to the official account of Darius I, Cambyses secretly killed his brother Bardia before departing for Egypt. A Magian named Gaumata then impersonated Bardia and seized the throne, while Cambyses died on the journey home. Darius and 6 noblemen killed the impostor, after which Darius became king. Herodotus tells a similar story with many dramatic details. Because Darius benefited from the outcome, however, some scholars suspect that the man he overthrew may actually have been Bardia, and that the story of impersonation was created to legitimize a coup. The surviving evidence does not settle the question. Whatever the truth, the crisis reveals what Cyrus could not control from the grave. Several sons provided choices for succession, but also created competing claims. Different parts of the empire could support different candidates. Darius had to confront a series of revolts in Babylon, Media, Elam, Persia, and other regions during 522 and 521 before the Common Era. On the Behistun monument, he inscribed the story of his victories in several languages and emphasized his Achaemenid ancestry. The rebellions proved that the structure created by Cyrus did not remain stable automatically. It had to be reaffirmed through armies, propaganda, and administrative organization. Darius was not a son of Cyrus, but he connected himself to the broader dynasty and married women from the founder's family. Atossa, a daughter of Cyrus, became one of the most important queens and the mother of Xerxes. Artistone, another daughter, also became a wife of Darius. Through these marriages, the new reign did not present itself as a break with the past. The prestige of Cyrus entered the legitimacy of Darius. This was later evidence of the power of his name. The ruler who held the throne needed to show that he was continuing the work of the founder rather than rejecting it. Under Darius, the empire was organized more systematically. Provinces and levels of tribute were defined more clearly. Roads and relay stations were developed. The gold daric appeared, and centers such as Susa and Persepolis expanded. Administration used several languages. Aramaic played a broad role, while Elamite, Akkadian, and Old Persian appeared in different settings. These achievements often caused maps of the empire under Darius to be used as illustrations of the reign of Cyrus. Distinguishing the two rulers reveals the real process. Cyrus created an empire by integrating kingdoms, while Darius turned that inheritance into a more durable and better documented mechanism. The difference does not diminish Cyrus. A person who opens a path rarely completes everything that follows. He did not need to build Persepolis, mint the daric, or fix the tax obligation of every satrapy in order to be regarded as the founder. What he left behind was a political idea proven in practice. Persians could stand at the center of a multilingual empire, use local traditions, and preserve supreme authority. Darius inherited that idea, modified it, and built it into institutions. By the age of Xerxes, a visitor could see delegations from many peoples on the reliefs of Persepolis and recognize in stone the vision Cyrus had begun through war and negotiation. The Achaemenid Empire survived for nearly 2 centuries after the death of Cyrus. During that time, its kings confronted rebellion, wars in Greece, disputes at court, and pressure on the frontiers, yet the broad structure did not vanish after a single defeat. Babylon rebelled several times but remained an important center. Egypt escaped Persian rule for a period and was later reconquered. Satraps could accumulate power of their own, but most continued to operate within the royal system. This endurance is a significant measure of the foundation Cyrus left behind. A random sequence of conquests usually dissolved when the army withdrew. Here, the dynasty created enough benefits, habits, and institutions for later generations to continue struggling within the same political framework. By the 4th century before the Common Era, Macedonia had risen under Philip II and then Alexander. In 334 before the Common Era, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor. After victories at the Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, he defeated Darius III, the last Achaemenid king. Persepolis was burned in 330, although the motive and degree of intent remain disputed. On the surface, this was the end of the empire founded by Cyrus. Alexander, however, could not rule simply by erasing everything Persian. He retained many satraps, employed local officials, adopted Persian clothing and court ceremony, married women from the Persian royal family, and encouraged closer ties between Macedonian and Iranian elites. The conqueror of the Achaemenids thus became one of the heirs to their methods. The connection between Alexander and Cyrus is clearest at Pasargadae. When Alexander passed through the Persian homeland in 330, before the Common Era, he visited the tomb of the founder. Later sources say that he ordered Aristobulus, a technically skilled member of his party, to enter and inspect it. According to the Greek descriptions, royal objects still remained inside. When Alexander returned from his eastern campaigns around 324, the tomb had been robbed, many objects had disappeared, and the body had been disturbed. He reacted with anger, ordered repairs, and punished or investigated those suspected of the crime. The details do not agree perfectly across the sources, but Alexander's concern for the tomb reflects the prestige of Cyrus in the world of the man who had defeated his dynasty. Alexander may have regarded Cyrus as a precedent for his own ambition. Both men had marched through Anatolia, Babylon, and Central Asia. Both had to find ways to persuade Iranians and many other communities to serve a king who came from a particular homeland. Alexander encountered Cyrus mainly through Greek tradition, however, especially the image of an ideal leader. By caring for the tomb of Cyrus, he could present himself not only as the destroyer of Persia, but as the legitimate king of Asia. Once again, the memory of Cyrus was used to legitimize a new power, just as Cyrus had once used the traditions of Media and Babylon for himself. After Alexander, Hellenistic kingdoms divided much of the former empire. The Seleucids ruled Iran and Mesopotamia for a time, after which Parthian and Sasanian dynasties created new Iranian empires. Cyrus did not remain equally visible in every period. Languages changed, religions developed, and stories of the past were reshaped. Pasargadae survived, but some communities gradually forgot the identity of the tomb. During the Islamic era, the structure became widely known as the tomb of the Mother of Solomon. Connecting an ancient monument to a figure from a newer religious tradition did not simply destroy its earlier memory. In some cases, the new name helped the site remain respected and protected for centuries. In the Greek world, Cyrus continued to live through literature. Herodotus completed the histories in the 5th century before the Common Era, more than 100 years after the death of Cyrus. He placed the king within a broad reflection on power, fortune, custom, and the rise of Persia. The Cyrus of Herodotus was talented, capable of listening, and sometimes willing to spare a defeated enemy, but he could not escape the limits of human life. His death at the hands of Tamiris gave his career a moral structure. The conqueror of many kingdoms failed when he continued to desire more. Herodotus was not writing a simple biography. He used the life of Cyrus to ask how power grows and why success already contains danger. Xenophon, writing the Cyropaedia early in the 4th century before the Common Era, chose another direction. He did not center the tragedy of ambition but the ability to lead. Cyrus was educated in self-control, learned to command, understood other people, and persuaded distant nations to obey willingly. Historical campaigns were rearranged, fictional characters were added, and the speeches reflected the philosophy of Xenophon rather than recorded voices from the 6th century. The work was read as a manual for rulers, a model of how to gain obedience without relying only on force. This ideal Cyrus profoundly influenced the way Europe and America later came to know him. Plato also referred to Cyrus in the Laws, presenting his reign as a period when the Persians maintained a better balance between freedom and obedience before royal education declined. This judgment served Plato's argument about government and education rather than offering an administrative study of Persia. Even so, it is significant that Greek writers from a world often at war with Persia could praise Cyrus. They did not forget that he was a conqueror, but they saw in him an ability later kings were thought to lack. His personal reputation crossed the boundary between enemy and admired ruler. Jewish tradition followed its own path of memory. Cyrus appeared not as a Greek hero or an ancestor of Israel, but as a foreign king used by God to fulfill a historical purpose. Permission to return, rebuild the temple, and restore the community created a positive image that endured for centuries. This does not mean that every biblical account of Cyrus is a precise chronicle by modern standards. The texts had religious purposes and were compiled in different settings. Yet they preserve important evidence A community displaced by an earlier empire remembered the policy of a Persian king as the turning point that opened a future. The differences among Babylonian, Hebrew, and Greek memories help explain why Cyrus cannot easily be contained within a single label. Babylonians emphasized the order of the temples. The people of Judah emphasized return and reconstruction. Xenophon emphasized leadership. Herodotus emphasized fate and limitation. Later, Persians honored Cyrus as a father and founder. Each community selected the part connected to its own experience. This does not make every account equally accurate, but it reveals the genuine reach of his influence. A person is remembered in so many different ways only when his actions have touched many worlds. During the European Renaissance and Enlightenment, the Cyropaedia was translated, printed, and read as a work about education, warfare, and political skill. Niccolò Machiavelli knew the tradition of Cyrus and considered founders like him while reflecting on power. Teachers used Xenophon's work as a model of Greek prose. Statesmen searched it for lessons in leadership, sometimes paying little attention to the boundary between history and fiction. Cyrus existed in Western thought mainly through a mirror created by the Greeks, while the cuneiform texts from his own age remained underground and unread. Thomas Jefferson provides a special connection for an American audience. He owned at least 2 editions of Xenophon's Cyropaedia. One, a parallel Greek and Latin edition printed in Glasgow in 1767, remains in the collection of the Library of Congress. Editorial marks on its pages show that Jefferson read the text carefully rather than keeping it as decoration. Cyrus was therefore part of the classical world, studied by an important figure of the American founding era. It would go beyond the evidence, however, to claim that Cyrus directly shaped the United States Constitution, or that the Cyrus cylinder served as a source for the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson read Xenophon alongside many other Greek and Roman authors. The influence belonged to a broad intellectual environment, not to a simple line running from Babylon to Philadelphia. During the 19th century, the decipherment of cuneiform and excavations in Mesopotamia transformed the modern understanding of Cyrus. In 1879, Hormuzd Rassam discovered the clay cylinder bearing his name among the ruins of Babylon. For the first time, the Greek and biblical traditions could be placed beside a Babylonian royal text produced very close to the conquest of 539 before the Common Era. The cylinder confirmed certain points, including the way Cyrus presented himself through Babylonian titles and his claim to have returned divine images and displaced people to their homes. At the same time, it showed how local propaganda shaped the memory of victory. The historical Cyrus no longer had to be seen only through the eyes of authors writing centuries later. Archaeology at Pasargadae gradually demonstrated that the founder had not ruled from a land without art or architecture. Palaces, stone platforms, garden channels, and the tomb reveal a deliberate royal program. Techniques from Lydia and Ionia stand beside Iranian and Mesopotamian traditions. Smaller objects, including decorative fragments, ceilings, and architectural elements, add to the written evidence. They show that cultural combination was more than a slogan. It was present in the materials, the fitting of stone, the forms of columns, and the design of space. Pasargadae is an architectural biography of a king who gathered many worlds into his court. In the 20th century, Cyrus became an important symbol of modern Iranian identity. In 1971, the government of Mohammad Reza Shah organized a celebration of 2,500 years of Persian monarchy at Pasargadae and Persepolis. Cyrus was presented as the origin of the nation, religious tolerance, and ancient kingship. The luxury of the celebration was also criticized for its distance from ordinary life and for its role in strengthening the contemporary regime. After the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the official treatment of the pre-Islamic past changed, but Cyrus did not disappear from social memory. He remained a symbol used by different groups for meanings that sometimes directly opposed one another. The Cyrus cylinder also acquired a modern political afterlife. A replica was placed at the headquarters of the United Nations, while speeches and exhibitions have sometimes called the object the earliest document of human rights. That interpretation introduced many people to Cyrus, but it can obscure the Babylonian setting. The text was not written to grant equal rights to every individual. It was a royal inscription praising a victorious king, using traditional language to legitimize his power and announce religious restoration. We can value the return of communities and divine images to their former homes without turning Cyrus into a democratic lawgiver. The best way to respect the past is not to make it resemble the present, but to understand the difference between them. The phrase "the First World Empire" requires the same caution. Akkad, Assyria, Babylon, and other structures of conquest existed before Cyrus. He was not the first ruler in history to govern many peoples. By the end of his life, however, Achaemenid power extended from Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean across Mesopotamia and Iran into Central Asia and the northwestern edge of the Indian subcontinent. This was the First Persian Empire and one of the largest multinational political structures the world had seen at that time. It may be described in broad terms as the first world power, provided that the limits of the phrase are explained and earlier empires are not erased. Scale should not be measured only by the area covered with color on a map. We do not know the precise borders of every region, especially in the east. Control changed according to distance, season, and the ability of royal representatives. A Babylonian city whose documents clearly used the regnal years of Cyrus differed from a distant tribe that paid tribute only occasionally. A Phoenician port governed by a client king differed from a garrison in Sogdiana. When a map gives all of them the same color, it offers a tool for imagination, not a description of every day in the lives of the inhabitants. The influence of Cyrus lay in the ability to connect these different relationships to one royal center, even though the degree of direct control was not the same. What then truly distinguished Cyrus from earlier conquerors? There is no single answer. Assyria had employed local officials and supported temples, when doing so served imperial interests. Babylon also integrated conquered lands, and the Medes had already constructed networks of authority across the plateau. Cyrus inherited many older tools. What stands out is the speed with which he combined them, moving from king of Anshan to a ruler who could be accepted at the same time as king of the Persians, successor to Media, master of Lydia, and king of Babylon. He did not erase every identity in order to create one common culture. He built a dynasty capable of standing above many identities. This method had moral and practical limits. It preserved local elites, but ordinary people were not asked whether they wished to belong to the empire. It restored some displaced communities, but its armies still killed when they met resistance. It respected temples while also using them to collect resources and legitimize royal authority. It opened routes for trade and at the same time demanded tribute and soldiers. If we use only the word tolerance, we risk forgetting the unequal distribution of power. If we use only the word violence, we fail to see the ability to adapt that allowed the system to endure. A mature biography must allow both sides to remain visible. The personal character of Cyrus is the hardest question of all. Was he genuinely more merciful than his contemporaries, or simply more skillful in the practical use of mercy? Did he believe in a divine mission, hunger for fame, seek to protect his homeland, or simply fail to recognize a point at which conquest should stop? The sources do not allow us to read his mind. His actions show that he recognized the value of forgiveness, retained officials from former regimes, and used local symbols. At other times, he pursued enemies, besieged cities, suppressed resistance, and marched toward a dangerous frontier in old age. A person could exercise political restraint while failing to restrain territorial ambition. Cyrus does not need to become either a saint or a tyrant for us to recognize him as an exceptional leader. The story of Harpagus helps reveal part of that ability. If the tradition has a historical foundation, Cyrus knew how to turn dissatisfaction at the court of Astyages into an alliance. After the victory, Harpagus continued to serve as a general and conquered the cities of Asia Minor. Instead of relying only on Persians, Cyrus entrusted responsibility to a Mede with both motive and ability. In Babylon, he relied on Ugbaru, the priesthood, and local scribes. In Lydia, the decision to use Pakties failed, but the court adjusted through Mazares and Harpagus. These examples show that government under Cyrus was a process of learning, not a perfect plan that had existed from the beginning. The pursuit of Croesus also demonstrates his sense of timing. If Cyrus had waited until the next campaigning season, Lydia might have assembled Babylon, Egypt, Sparta, and other allies. He accepted logistical risk and attacked first. In Babylon, by contrast, he did not turn the victory at Opis into an immediate sack of the capital. He allowed Ugbaru to enter, protect the rights, and prepare the day of the king's formal arrival. One situation required speed, while the other required restraint. The career of Cyrus did not depend on one repeated habit, but on the ability to distinguish between different kinds of moments. Pasargadae offers another quieter way to assess him. There, power appeared through water flowing in gardens, through stone columns, and through spaces designed to receive delegations. It was not a closed palace built only for defense. Architectural influences from many regions show that Cyrus did not fear allowing the Persian center to carry the marks of conquered peoples. The court absorbed skill without treating that act as weakness. Many later empires did the same, from Hellenistic kingdoms and Rome to later Iranian dynasties. Successful founders are often those who can transform what they borrow into a symbol of their own authority. The tomb on the plain is a more fitting final image than any scene of victory. The palaces have lost their roofs, the gardens no longer survive in their original form, and the empire has disappeared from the map, but the small stone chamber still stands. It does not tell us whether Cyrus was good or evil. It does not confirm the story of Tomyris, the oracle given to Croesus, or every speech in Xenophon. Its survival tells us only that a real human being once existed beneath the layers of literature. He was born around 600 before the Common Era, succeeded his father around 559, defeated Astyages around 550, captured Lydia in the middle of the 540s, took Babylon in 539, and died in 530. Those dates provide the skeleton, but history was made in the spaces between them. Between 559 and 550, a local king constructed an alliance strong enough to oppose his former master. Between Media and Lydia, defeated enemies became part of a new army. Between Sardis and Babylon came years of eastern expansion, the delegation of authority to generals, and the challenge of holding widely separated regions. Between the victory at Opis and the entrance into Babylon stood the decision to protect the city and build an image of legitimacy. Between 539 and 530 came the less celebrated work of arranging government, preparing a succession, and defending the frontiers. No single day created Cyrus the Great. His most important legacy, therefore, lies neither in the Cyrus cylinder alone, nor in the tomb, nor in the number of square miles colored on a map. It lies in the way political authority could be imagined. A Persian king could stand before Babylonians as the protector of Marduk, before Medes as a legitimate successor, before Persian nobles as the leader of a dynasty, and before distant territories as the great king who demanded tribute. These roles did not cancel one another. The empire did not require every community to share the same memory. It required different memories to find a reason to place the king within their own story. Cyrus left behind actions that communities could interpret in positive ways, even when his motives included political interest. The people of Judah remembered the return. Official Babylonian memory preserved the restoration of divine images. Greek writers imagined a leader who inspired willing service. Iranians saw the founder of an imperial tradition. In the late afternoon at Pasargadae today, light changes across the steps of the tomb as the plain opens behind it. There are no longer messengers from Lydia, processions carrying Babylonian tribute, or armies waiting for orders to cross a river. The distances from Anshan to Sardis, from Ecbatana to Babylon, and from Pasargadae to Central Asia can still be measured on a map, but the political road Cyrus traveled cannot be reduced to an arrow. It included decisions made in the face of betrayal, the employment of former enemies, the ability to stop destruction when victory was already secure, and the choice to continue conquering until the campaign from which he never returned. Cyrus was not born with the title the Great. He was born into a family that already possessed kingship but ruled a far smaller territory than the one he eventually left behind. His victory was not guaranteed by fate simply because Herodotus told stories of prophetic dreams. Every step could have failed. The Median army might have remained loyal. Croesus might have received his reinforcements. Babylon might have united around Nabonidus. A trusted general might have betrayed him. Cambyses might have lost the throne. The fact that none of these possibilities ended the career of Cyrus resulted from favorable circumstances, the mistakes of his opponents, the ability of his followers, and his own decisions. In the end, the life of Cyrus raises a wider question about power. Victory can be won in one day, but political order is created over many years. A wall can be crossed, a treasury seized, and an enemy king captured. Afterward, temples must still open, canals must still be repaired, scribes must know which regnal year to write, nobles must decide where their loyalty lies, and ordinary people must continue to live. Cyrus succeeded not because he resolved every contradiction, but because enough communities believed they could continue to exist beneath the new kingship. More than 25 centuries later, we still do not know the sound of his voice. No certain portrait looks back at us with his real face. His youth remains hidden behind legend. His eastern campaigns lack a secure sequence. The fates of Croesus and Nabonidus remain unresolved, and his death in the story of Tomyris is only one of several versions. These gaps give the biography its depth. They remind us that history is not a novel in which the author knows every motive. It is an effort to approach a human life through incomplete traces, to stop where the evidence ends, and still to recognize the outline of an extraordinary career. That outline begins in southern Iran around 600 before the Common Era, when a child of the royal house of Anshan was born. It passes through the moment Cyrus inherited the throne of Cambyses I in 559, through the revolt against Astyages and the defeat of Media around 550, through the pursuit that brought down Sardis across the mountains and steppes of the east, and finally to the gates of Babylon in 539. It continues in clay tablets bearing a new regnal year, in the decision to return divine images, in the preparation of Cambyses for succession, and in the final campaign of 530. After his death, the line does not end. It passes through Darius, Xerxes, Alexander, Xenophon, the biblical authors, archaeologists, and modern readers. The tomb at Pasargadae needs no inscription to make its final statement. 6 stone steps support a chamber barely large enough for one person. Outside it once stood a vast empire. Inside there is only silence. The contrast does not deny the power of Cyrus. It returns that power to the scale of a human life. He once made kings surrender, caused cities to change the regnal years on their documents, and led distant peoples to speak the same name. Yet his most durable achievement was not the ownership of land, because every one of his borders eventually changed. What remains is a model of rule, a memory debated by many cultures, and the story of a king who understood that conquering the world was different from allowing many worlds to continue living together.